That's easy for me. Very little. Thank the Lord. And I think that's also something that God gave us was I have no memory of the next 22 days after I left the choir loft that morning.
It came late to Pathfinders, which is our Sunday school class that we go to prior to Dave singing in the 11:15 service. At that time, he was also singing in the 8:15 service. So he had driven himself. I actually did not feel well that morning. And I thought, I just won't go to church this morning. But something said, yes, you will. So I did arrive late at Sunday school. And Dave he acted a bit strange. And I just had a funny feeling that I needed to kind of keep an eye on him. So I believe it was after the first hymn, and I noticed that Dave, again, was acting odd up there in the choir loft, and he sits at the very end. I saw him get up and leave, so I immediately left, and by the time I actually got into the choir room, he was having a lot of difficulty figuring out what to do with his choir robe. So I drove us immediately to the hospital, and they said that he needed to have a CAT scan. They thought he was having a stroke. The next thing I knew, I was told that I needed to come back there. They had given him the TPA, which is the drug that they need to give in a certain time allotment. So they asked me a lot of questions about when I thought this had started. And anyway, he began to have a very difficult time in the ER, and they took him back for another CAT scan, and this time they said that he had developed a brain bleed on the right side. And they had called for the medical air rescue from Shands, and that he would be airlifted there. So I began to call family members, of course. Our daughter Wendy was actually out in Washington State visiting some friends, but I was able to reach her husband. I reached our son, Todd and Krista, had difficulty reaching the other son, Jim, and finally, I never really got a hold of him until after we had been at the hospital for a few hours that afternoon. Anyway, when the helicopter arrived, I had already been notified by the medical personnel that I would not be allowed on the helicopter with Dave, that they would take him and I would need to find some way to get to Shands. At that point, I didn't even know where it was. So when the team arrived, of course, the pilot stayed with the helicopter, and the other two came in. One went directly to the nurse's station, I'm assuming getting all of the medical information. And the other gentleman came in to the room where I was, and by that time they had sedated Dave, so he was quiet. And I was kind of picking up, personal things that would not be going with him. And I don't know, for some reason, I just thought, I'm going to ask one more time about going with him. And somehow, I think the Lord just put those words in my mouth, and I said to the man, I really would like to go with my husband. And he said, well, that's highly unusual. And I said, I can't let him make this trip by himself, sir. So he kind of looked at me and then asked me how much I weighed and had I ever been in a helicopter before. And let me talk to the pilot, he said. So he came back into the room and he said, yes, that we would be going together. So in terms of things of how I feel about how the Lord directed us during this time, not only the 22 days that Dave spent in ICU, neuro ICU at Shands, but also the 22 days that he spent then in rehab. That was probably the first thing where I really felt that somehow I developed kind of a calm during that ride. And I didn't know what lay in store for us, but I knew I wasn't in charge. So we got there, it landed and on the roof, and it was kind of like Grey's Anatomy. The doors fly open and they come running. And in we went to the trauma bay. They took him immediately for another CAT scan, came back and said now he had developed a brain bleed on the left side. His temperature was 105.3. His blood pressure was way over 200. His blood sugar was up over 300 because he is insulin-dependent diabetic. And, then you just begin the motions of going through the insurance. And then they took him, and we basically just ran with him to what seemed forever to the ICU for the neurology, and that's where we were for the next 22 days.
Our kids have told me what they were telling me and what I was responding, but that's part of what God did. I was not aware of what was going on. I can tell you, all I know from that 22 days is that I was on a train from here to Kansas, and then on a bus from Kansas down to a dude ranch, and I went riding horses. And that's the only memory I have, and I have no memory of talking with the kids or Rita or anything during that 22-day period. I'm not sure I'd want to remember some of the incidents that occurred, but I didn't.
So thankful he didn't. But, then the kids started to arrive. Todd and Krista they drove from D.C. nonstop, and they were the first ones to get there. They had intubated Dave on the plane, on the helicopter, and so he was basically on life support at that point. By that time, I was able to get a hold of Jim, Dave's son. And I knew that, and then also in the background of all of this, this was April 22nd, Dave was going to turn 80 on May 5th, and so we had a very large gathering planned, with entertainment and the whole schmear. So I made a couple of phone calls to friends, neighbors, of ours, and somehow they got all of that canceled for me. They took care of my mail. They took care of our plants. You can't even begin to count the blessings that they gave us. Right. I came home actually twice. We had, I had to come home I was still in my church clothes. I had to come home and get some clothes, of course, and some money and all of those normal things. One time when our granddaughter Hannah was there, she stayed with me so she could drive me. Todd and Krista drove me home the first time. And basically it was, just in that ICU, there is a place right in the room where someone can stay, like in a window seat that becomes a bed. So that was where I camped out. That's where Wendy, when she got there, which was, I believe, the next morning, finally, for her to try to get from, I think she was in Spokane, to get to Gainesville was a bit of a trek. I think she got there the next morning or thereabouts. At this point, Dave was still unresponsive and intubated. And the temperature, they could not get his temperature down. In fact, it was going up. They had him, on one of those cooling coil things with, the equipment, machinery was unbelievable that was in that room. And when our granddaughter Karen got there, shortly thereafter, she said, "Grandma, would you be okay if I started a carrying bridge?" Well, I didn't know what a carrying bridge was. She explained to me. And I said, "Yeah, that sounds great," because by that time, my phone had gone dead and I had no charger. I had no idea how to notify the rest of the relatives or whatever, because at this point, it didn't look good. Situation did not look good. And so that's another one of the blessings that Karen was able to set that up and wrote out exactly what was happening. I think she put on Facebook that there was a carrying bridge started for Dave, and that was the most marvelous thing, because we were able to communicate basically daily or hourly if you want. We heard from people that we hadn't heard from in years. People from California that had moved away, or Alaska. It was just incredible what that was. So that truly was another one of those things where, things were being directed for us.
Somebody else was in charge.
The dark days, I just coined that phrase, I guess, because it was a time where you absolutely had no clue as to, your life is in total turmoil. You don't have any idea what's going to happen or how you're going to be able to handle this, and how to handle it. And so about day 3 or day 4, an example would be that about day 3 or day 4, in the wee hours of the morning, Wendy was there with me, and I believe she was the one. A nurse came in, because they work in 12-hour shifts, and a nurse came in, and she said, "Can we, talk about what's the expectation here? We have no idea what is going on and really what a lot of this equipment is measuring." And basically there was a large monitor at the foot of Dave's bed that showed brain activity, and it was horribly erratic. I had no idea what it was, but once he explained to me what it was, I could see how erratic it was. And he said, "Well, by now we would like to have seen some change." So I simply just said, "All right, God, it's in your hands. This is not how Dave would want to live. So if this is the plan, then take him right now." He would never want to live like this. I could envision, being in some sort of a nursing facility and for days or weeks or months. And prior to that, Todd many times would take a hold of Dave's hand and yell in Dave's good ear, "Dad, this is Todd. Squeeze my hand if you hear me." And there was just no response whatsoever. And he would do this over and over. Wendy would sing to her dad. She would read the sports page to her dad. She'd hold hands with him. She'd talk to him. And there was no response. So I just had that plea to the Lord to just let him go. And the next morning, a few hours later, when Todd and Krista got there, Todd did his usual go over and yell in Dad's ear, squeezed my hand, and Dave squeezed his hand. And then one eye opened. And then shortly thereafter, both eyes opened. And of course, they don't remove the ventilator right away, but he gave us plenty of indication that he wanted that thing out of his mouth. And so then a whole new phase started. So, yeah, those 22 days are the dark days. I mean, there were other things, you know. He had a swallowing problem. He couldn't eat. So eventually they had to put a feeding tube in. He had lost 22 pounds in 22 days by the time we left there. There was one night where I just had to get back to the hotel and actually sleep a few hours. And so I left him alone. And they had put him in what they called a step-down unit from the ICU. And he had decided he needed to get up, and when he did, of course, he fell. So the next morning then, they told me that he had broken his tibia. Then later they came that day, the orthopedic surgeon came in and said, I've reviewed that x-ray and I think that's an old break. Did he ever play football? Yes, he played football. High school and college, he played football. Well, I think that's a football injury. I think that's an old fracture that he may have had. So, I mean, it was something like that over and over. Nothing was ever really smooth. Up until the day of his birthday when he turned 80, and for some reason the nurse gave him a very large cup of cranberry juice with a straw. And he was so thirsty, and he sucked that down immediately, and of course he aspirated it into his lungs. And Todd and Krista surprised us by coming that day for his birthday. I didn't know they were coming, and thankfully, again, you can believe in a coincidence, or you can believe that the Lord directed them to come. He was choking terribly. I couldn't find anyone to help me. And Krista took off running someplace. I mean, all these bells and whistles are going off, and he had a horrible gray color, and he was choking to death. And she ran somewhere and came back with somebody who called somebody, and they, of course, had to, aspirate his lungs. And so then they rushed him back. We ran with him for the second time back to the regular ICU in the neuro unit. And that's where he stayed then until we left 22 days. I don't know how many days later, maybe 10 or 11, I don't know. They had just decided that they were going to try to get him to teach him to walk. And I mean, you just didn't know what you were going to be dealing with. He didn't know how to do anything. He didn't recognize a fork or a spoon. He didn't know what he was to do with the food. It's just so hard to explain, but those were the dark days.
I came into consciousness of what was going on around me at the Villages Rehab Center. I wasn't aware of the transportation or anything. The first time that I recall going back to that facility was when we went back for the checkup.
And that was in August, the end of August, because at that point, when we left there, after the 22 days, they were unable to really give me any indication as to how much damage there really was to Dave's brain, because there was still so much blood there residing in his brain. And until that moved out, So our appointment was for around the end of August, and by that time they felt that they would be able to give us an indication of which parts of the brain had been injured, and that was true. At the end of August, we found out things that was an injury. He actually really doesn't have much memory of the 22 days in rehab here up until about the last 7 to 9 days, and that's another one of the huge blessings that the Lord provided, and that would be Rosemary.
Yeah, that person came into my life. Thank the Lord for that. I was struggling with having to learn how to say words, how to count, and they were bringing me first, second grade type materials and asking me to tell them what this was and write that and this sort of thing. And I was in absolute unbelievable concern or confusion about even trying to accommodate the person. And she came into the room on a replacement for the person who had been there before. And she brought in a computer. And again, you can think about all you want, but it was God's blessing that she walked in. And she says, now let's talk about some things. And immediately, it's so much easier to understand what I was being asked to do and to begin to learn how to talk, how to count, all the things that you started doing when you were in first grade was where I started with her. And thank God for her. 150 days later, she said, well, I think I've done about all I can do. I said, are you sure? But she's come back later, and she gives me now about a 92.
Yes, Rosemary has become a part of our family, and
yes.
As Dave said, she saw him basically she worked with him for almost a year and a half, over 150 times that she came to our house and introduced him to different applications. Wendy bought him an iPad, and these were, some of them very simple with just pictures, photographs, but they can be interactive where he can talk to the iPad, and the iPad talks back to him and it gongs him if he gets the wrong answer. It gives him a happy face if he gets the right answer.
Tears.
And so that's another one of the blessings. I mean, then, after we got home, then in July of that year, he developed sepsis from a urinary tract infection, which he'd had multiple times before, and Shands could not figure out, because he had sepsis while we were there at Shands as well, and they could not figure out where it was coming from. And so that's another one of our blessings, that we had a infectious disease doctor that came and treated Dave in the hospital, and she listened. I told her his story. I told her how many times he'd had sepsis. It was always from the same urinary tract infection, and I asked her, is there any way that we could keep seeing you? And she said, highly unusual, but yes, I will take him on as a patient. And she still, Dr. Jamangle, she still has Dave as a patient, and she's introduced a new drug into his routine every other week, and at this point he hasn't had an infection now for over 2 years. There's just so many blessings. The neighbors, once we got home, the bringing in the food, or when he felt that he could start to play golf again, which was, many, many months later, the men in the neighborhood that he had played with, they picked him up for over a year and brought him home and watched over him and brought his belongings that he would forget in their golf cart and would bring them back. And they joked about that it takes a village to keep Dave going. A friend, another neighbor that's a retired nurse, when I had trouble with the feeding tube, she came over early one morning and explained to me, what I was doing, how I could do it better, and that there was some infection going on there, and we got that cleared up. Another neighbor who's a retired nurse came with a prayer shawl that had been knitted by a group that she belongs to. Another friend that I play cards with, she spent the entire day with me prior to Dave being released from Shands, where we visited different rehab centers, some of which going in you would know that we better get out of here. Others, and help me ask the right questions. There's just so many times that people put certain people in our lives for certain reasons.
Interestingly about Dr. Jamingo, when she came into the room to see me, she looked at the chart, looked at me, looked at the chart again. She says, "I think I know you." And she says, "Have you had urinary tract problems before?" "Yeah." And she says, "Well, I used to work in a lab before I got my degree. That was what I was doing to earn the money to go to college and go to medical school. And I worked on you at that time. I worked on the information that was coming, the lab work that was being provided." So she says, "I've got some background on you. I think I can handle this problem now really well." So, how does that happen? I mean, talk to me. Something's going on. Well, Sunday starts here. Of course, we're all suffering from the loss of music other than what's being provided, which is great, but it's not like the full choir and stuff like that. I really miss that at Christmas and
Easter.
Will we get you back in the choir again?
Yeah, right. Easter is another major, the music of those holidays, and the church is so beautiful. But, so Sunday starts here. We normally either go home or go out to eat, and then we spend the day together with our cat, Norman. And Tuesday morning starts with the golf group on the golf course, and we play championship golf courses. On Monday. Yeah, Monday morning. And then Monday afternoon is chores around the house, whatever's to do, or we got errands to run, whatever. Tuesday is kind of easy. Then Wednesday morning, we play golf in a group of friends who were with us through this whole period. And then Thursday, we have a golf group that I play with, again, championship. Friday, and the afternoon is chores and that sort of thing. Friday is relaxing, doing whatever we want to do. And now with COVID gone, I think we'll probably be doing more traveling. But with COVID, it's been kind of easy just to cloister up and be in the house and read books and stuff like that, which is a big difference too. That's another blessing. When I got out, I couldn't read. I mean, I look at the page. I could see things, but I couldn't read. So, but then Saturday again is another golf game, and we start all over with Sunday morning here.
One of the things that I have forgotten to mention is that during the time after one of the things that made it so difficult for us to work with Dave was that he was responding to us. We had no idea that he actually was not what I would call awake. We did not realize that until probably a couple of months after he came home, when he started to really have difficulty communicating, and then it was found that he was suffering from non-convulsive brain seizures. So what had been happening is that as Rosemary worked with him, then she would come, like, say, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So she'd work with him on Monday. On Wednesday, she'd come, and he would have forgotten everything that they did on Monday. Same way on Friday, he didn't know what they did on Wednesday. We couldn't figure it out. Well, then it became perfectly clear as the seizures got worse and got longer. Lots of trips to the hospital, lots of ambulances in the middle of the night, that sort of thing. Again, we found a wonderful neurologist, Dr. Castaldo, and he put him on some medicine, and it helped immediately for a few months, and then all of a sudden it got much worse again, and this time it was really, really bad in terms of the length of the seizures. And what had happened was his body was reacting negatively to that drug. So instead of it helping him, it was making it much, much worse. So then he now is on a different anti-seizure drug, and that has worked beautifully. So he's not had any. He has, every so often we do neurological testing, but he has not had any seizures now for over a year that I've been able to see, and certainly no abnormal brain activity from the EEGs. So the last year has been probably the best that we've had in the last 3.5 years since this saga started. He can't work the computer any longer. What used to be like an appendage of him now becomes something that just sits on his desk because he's just not able to do that. But once the seizures got under control, then Rosemary could really go to work with him and taught him to read, taught him different strategies to use when he can't think of a word. Or something that he's trying to explain to someone. We just go from day to day. He leaves the house in the morning now and drives the golf cart himself as far as even Nancy Lopez to play golf. And when he leaves, I just say, okay, Lord, he's in your hands. Watch over him. He voluntarily gave up his driver's license a couple of years ago. He, of course, resigned from being when he had the stroke, he was clerk of session here at the church, and he gave that up because he's not able to, just not able to mentally handle that and work write up the notes and all that sort of thing. So in terms of everyday activities, I think for the most part, people that don't know what's happened would never guess what he's been through and how far he's come. And the children have just been unbelievable in their support and helping constantly.
It's an interesting point about the family. We had worked for years independently with this one and independently with that one, but we'd never seemed to have been able to meld everything together. And since the stroke, and not necessarily related to it, but since the stroke, the events of our lives have brought our family together totally. And Todd and Krista were helpful to Elaine Salas, who's my daughter's younger daughter, when she was in Washington, D.C. at Walter Reed. So they would see her, and it was a blessing to her because some family was in town that she could call if she had problems. The families they've been through some tragedies, yes, and they've also been through some weddings this summer and spring. So, and everybody was there to enjoy and have fun together as a family. So it's been, again, another blessing that whole thing has been a part of what's made it easier to be around now and more fun to be in the family. Well, one of the toughest things because I spent a lifetime trying to be of service in my church and in other things that I was involved in the community and in hockey and that sort of thing. And the toughest thing I have ever done is come to your office and say, I can't do this. Can't just has not been something I've had in my vocabulary in my lifetime. And God bless I bless him for that every day. Now I'm getting to the point where, I want to do some things and then I have a memory, not a memory, but I'll have an experience that, whoops, maybe that's not something I better do again kind of thing. Maybe I'm stretching myself too far, but from a church standpoint, I think we have been blessed, in my opinion, by the intervention of the Father, and I've had occasion to be able to speak and give prayers for our kids at weddings and things like that, and I felt the presence of the Lord there as they start their lives and this sort of thing. So there's a peculiar warmth in the church at this time that everyone can enjoy and can rely on being there when you have the issue that you need that help. It's here.
No, I think he said it very well.
And I didn't have to think around it. That's one thing Mary, she taught me how to get around the blockage, that sort of thing. And that's a big part of how I speak now.
I think the most important thing is just don't give up. Don't give up, and trust. Trust in the Lord that there is a plan. There is a plan. Don't know what it is. Maybe we'll never find out. But in terms of the church, I think that if you have to find another thing that you could get involved in, then go ahead and try it. That's basically what Dave does, and he does stretch his limitations. He often forgets his age and his health limitations, and then he has a problem. But
one other thing I would add is one of the things that we've enjoyed ever since we came here and before we came to North Lake was that we were a member of a small group and doing Bible study. That group is now no longer at New Life and has gone its separate ways as we have here. And we still meet monthly to study the Word of God. And that's the kind of attitude and thing and the help and the feeling we got when we went to Sunday school here. And I think everyone needs that learning experience and needs to have that contact with people of like interest and like thoughts about the Lord and like involvement in the Lord's life, in their lives.